My mother destroyed our family, or at least, that's what I believed for 15 years, until the day a letter arrived with my father's name on it, written in handwriting I hadn't seen since the funeral. I remember staring at the envelope for a long time, turning it over in my hands like it might explain itself if I just waited long enough. But it didn't. It just sat there, quiet and heavy, like it knew something I didn't. By then, I had built a life most people would call successful. I owned a consulting firm in downtown Chicago, had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a watch that cost more than my first car, and a calendar so full I barely had time to think about anything beyond the next meeting, the next deal, the next flight. And that was exactly how I liked it. Because thinking meant remembering, and remembering always led back to her. My mother. The woman who walked out when I was 16, or at least, that's the version of the story I carried with me all these years, the version my father repeated in quiet, tired tones, like he was trying to protect me from something worse. She made her choice, he used to say, never raising his voice, never speaking badly about her directly, which somehow made it hurt even more, because it sounded like disappointment instead of anger. I built my life around that sentence. I worked harder than anyone else in my class, took extra shifts in college, refused help from anyone, especially from her, though she never tried to reach out anyway. Not once, not a phone call, not a birthday card, nothing. It made it easier to believe she didn't care. It made it easier to hate her. The last time I saw her was outside the courthouse, the day everything ended. I remember the sky was gray, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and she stood there in a plain coat, her hands clasped in front of her like she didn't know what to do with them. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned away before she could speak. I told myself she didn't deserve it. I told myself she had already said enough by leaving. For years, that memory stayed exactly the same, fixed and certain, like a photograph I never questioned. Until the letter. It came from a law office I barely recognized, forwarded from my father's estate months after everything had been settled, which didn't make sense at first, because there had been no secrets left to uncover, no hidden accounts, no surprises, just a modest inheritance and a lifetime of carefully managed expectations. But this envelope didn't belong to any of that. It felt different, personal, intentional. I sat at my desk, the city buzzing below me, horns echoing faintly through the glass, and I ran my finger along the edge of the seal without opening it. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. Whatever was inside couldn't change anything, I told myself. The past was already decided. The story was already written. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way my name was written in my father's handwriting, slightly slanted, familiar in a way that caught me off guard. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I didn't want to admit, a quiet doubt that had been sitting somewhere in the back of my mind all these years, waiting for a reason to surface. I finally opened it, slowly, carefully, like I was afraid the words inside might disappear if I moved too fast. The paper inside was thin, folded neatly, and for a second, I just looked at it, my hands suddenly unsteady. Then I read the first line. Your mother didn't abandon me. She saved you. I read it again. And again. The words didn't change. But something inside me did. The office around me faded, the noise of the city disappeared, and all I could hear was the echo of that sentence, repeating itself over and over, breaking apart everything I thought I knew. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the page, trying to make sense of it, but there was no immediate explanation, no clear answer, just a single statement that didn't fit into the story I had lived by for half my life. My chest felt tight, not with anger, not yet, but with something else, something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. And for the first time in 15 years, I realized I might have been wrong about the one person I had spent so long refusing to understand. I did not finish reading the letter right away because something about that first sentence made it impossible to continue. Like my mind had hit a wall it was not prepared to break through. So I folded the paper back along the same crease and set it on my desk, as if putting distance between us might make it easier to breathe. But it did not. The words stayed with me, echoing in a way that felt louder than anything outside my window. For years, my life had been built on certainty, on clear lines between right and wrong, between people who stayed and people who left, and my mother had always existed on the wrong side of that line, not just in memory, but in every decision I made, every relationship I kept at a distance, every excuse I gave myself for not looking back. I told people I was focused, disciplined, driven, but the truth was simpler than that. I did not trust easily, and I did not forgive at all. That belief had served me well, at least on the surface. I built a company from nothing, starting in a small office space that barely fit 2 desks, working 16-hour days until I did not have to anymore. And even then I kept going because stopping felt dangerous, like silence might bring something back I was not ready to face. People respected me. They listened when I spoke. They assumed I had everything figured out, and I let them believe it. Because it was easier than explaining the part of me that still felt like a 16-year-old standing outside a courthouse, watching his mother walk away without saying a word. Or at least, that is how I remembered it. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, trying to replay that moment again. But something about it felt different now, like a photograph that had been altered in a way so subtle I had never noticed before. I could still see her standing there, her coat too thin for the weather, her expression unreadable, but the details around it felt less certain, the edges less sharp. Had she really said nothing, or had I simply refused to hear it? The thought unsettled me more than I expected. I stood up and walked over to the window, pressing my hand lightly against the glass as I looked out at the city below, people moving in steady lines, cars inching through traffic, everything continuing exactly as it should, untouched by whatever shift had just started inside me. I had spent years avoiding anything that connected me to her. No visits, no calls, no questions, not even after my father passed away, when it might have made sense to reach out, to at least inform her. But I did not. I told myself she had made her choice a long time ago, and that was the end of it. But now, with that letter sitting behind me on the desk, that certainty felt thinner, like something I had accepted without ever truly examining. I turned back slowly, my eyes settling on the folded paper again, and this time I did not hesitate as long. I picked it up, unfolded it carefully, and forced myself to read beyond the first line, even though part of me resisted, even though part of me already knew that whatever came next was not going to fit into the story I had been telling myself for most of my life. I forced myself to keep reading, even though every instinct in me wanted to stop and put the letter away like it was something dangerous, something that could undo more than I was ready to lose. But the words pulled me in, steady and deliberate, written in the same careful tone my father had always used when he wanted me to listen closely, when he wanted to make sure I understood something that mattered. He wrote that the version of events I had lived with was incomplete, that there were things he had chosen not to tell me because he believed it was the only way to protect me at the time. And as I read that line, I felt something tighten in my chest, not just confusion, but resistance, because for years I had believed he was the one person who never lied to me. He explained that the situation that led to my mother leaving was far more complicated than I had been told, that decisions had been made quickly, under pressure, and that my mother had insisted on taking responsibility for something that was never truly hers to carry. And I stopped there for a moment, my eyes fixed on that sentence, trying to process what it meant without letting it fully take shape in my mind. Responsibility for what? That question echoed louder than anything else, but the letter did not answer it immediately. It moved slowly, almost carefully, as if my father knew that too much truth all at once would be impossible to accept. He wrote about mistakes, about judgment calls that spiraled into consequences he had not anticipated, and about how those consequences could have followed me, could have shaped my future in ways he refused to allow. And as I read those words, something inside me began to shift again, a subtle but undeniable crack in the foundation I had built my entire understanding on. I had always believed that my mother chose to leave, that she walked away from us because she wanted a different life, because staying was not enough for her. But this letter suggested something entirely different, something that did not align with the image I had held onto for so long. I felt my hands tighten around the paper as I continued reading, my eyes moving faster now, searching for something clear, something definitive that would either confirm or deny what I was starting to suspect. But instead, the letter gave me pieces, fragments of a story that had been carefully hidden, not just from me, but from everyone who had ever asked questions. My father admitted that there had been an investigation, that certain actions taken within his business had raised serious concerns, and that those concerns could have led to consequences that would not only affect him, but me as well. And that was when I realized that whatever had happened back then was not as simple as I had been told. He described long nights of discussion, arguments that ended in silence, and a decision that my mother made despite his objections, a decision that would change everything. She insisted on stepping in, on taking the blame in a way that redirected attention away from him, and, more importantly, away from me. And as I read that line, I felt something in my chest drop, like the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the desk, the letter now spread open in front of me as if I needed to see all of it at once to believe it was real. But even then, it felt impossible to fully grasp. I tried to match these words with the memories I had, tried to reconcile the image of my mother walking away with the idea that she had stayed, in a way that mattered more than I had ever understood, and the two did not fit together, not yet. My father wrote that she never defended herself, not in court, not in front of family, not even in front of me, because doing so would have revealed the truth he had chosen to hide, and that truth, according to him, would have put everything I had worked for at risk before I had even begun to build it. I sat there in silence after reading that part, the city outside still moving, still alive, completely unaware that in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my own past was beginning to unravel piece by piece. I kept reading, even though my vision had started to blur slightly, not from tears but from the strain of trying to reconcile two completely different versions of my life. And my father's words did not slow down. They became clearer, more direct, as if he knew this was the part one would struggle with the most. He admitted that the investigation into his business had uncovered irregularities that could have escalated into something much more serious, something that would have followed our family name for years, and more importantly, something that would have been attached to me before I had even graduated high school. He wrote that my mother saw that future before he did, that she understood the long-term consequences in a way he had been too proud to accept, and that she made a decision he could not stop, no matter how much he argued against it. She stepped forward and accepted responsibility in a way that redirected everything away from him and away from me. And in doing so, she gave up her place in our lives without ever asking for recognition or understanding. I felt my throat tighten as I read that sentence again, slower this time, letting each word settle in a way I had avoided before. Gave up her place in our lives. That was how he described it. Not abandonment, not betrayal, a sacrifice. The word felt foreign in the context of my mother, because for 15 years I had refused to associate her with anything that required selflessness, and now I was being asked to see her in a completely different light. I leaned back in my chair again, the leather creaking softly beneath me, and stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. But the more I thought about it, the more the past began to shift in small, unsettling ways. Memories I had once considered solid started to feel incomplete, like there had always been something missing that I simply never questioned. I remembered how quickly everything had happened back then, how the explanations were always brief, always controlled, how my father would change the subject whenever I asked too many questions, and how I eventually stopped asking altogether because it seemed easier to accept what I was told than to keep pushing against something that never moved. But now, reading his own words, I realized that silence had not been an absence of truth. It had been a shield, one that he and my mother had both held up in different ways, for reasons I was only beginning to understand. He wrote that she refused to let me visit her, refused to let him tell me where she was, because she did not want me to see her that way, did not want me to carry that image with me into the future she had chosen for me. And I felt something in my chest tighten again, sharper this time, because I had spent years believing she did not care enough to reach out, when in reality, she had been the one keeping the distance on purpose. Not out of indifference, but out of protection. I closed my eyes for a moment, the letter still open in my hands, and tried to imagine what that must have been like for her, to disappear from her own life, to let her own son believe the worst about her, and to never correct it, not even once. I could not fully grasp it, not yet, but the weight of it was beginning to settle in a way that felt impossible to ignore. When I opened my eyes again, I looked down at the page, my father's handwriting steady and familiar, and for the first time, I noticed something I had overlooked. Before, a slight tremor in the lines toward the end, as if even he had struggled to put these words down. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, not from me, not for himself, but that I deserved to know the truth before it was too late, before the version of the story I had lived with became permanent in a way that could never be undone. I sat there in silence after reading that, the letter resting in my hands, and for the first time in years, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel when it came to my mother. Not anger, not resentment, but something quieter, something heavier. Doubt about everything I thought I knew, and the beginning of a question I could no longer ignore. If she had not walked away, then where had she gone, and why had I never tried to find out? For a long time, I did not move from that chair, the letter still open in my hands as if putting it down would somehow make everything less real, but it did not. Nothing about this felt like something I could step away from anymore, not after everything I had just read. The question my father left hanging at the end of his letter did not feel rhetorical. It felt like something I was meant to answer, something I had avoided for years without even realizing it. Where had she gone? I had never asked. Not once. That realization settled over me with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because it was not just about her absence, it was about my choice to accept that absence without question. I told myself I had my reasons, that I was protecting myself, that I was honoring what my father had told me, but now those reasons felt thinner, less certain, like they had been built on something incomplete from the beginning. I looked back down at the letter, scanning the final lines again, searching for anything that might point me in the right direction, but my father had not included an address, not a phone number, not even a city, just the truth, as if he believed that would be enough to guide me forward. For a moment, I felt a familiar instinct rise up, the same one that had kept me moving forward for years without looking back. The instinct to close this chapter, to tell myself that whatever had happened was already over and could not be changed, but it did not feel as convincing as it used to. Not anymore. I stood up slowly and walked back to my desk, placing the letter down with more care than I expected, as if it had become something fragile, something that needed to be handled differently than everything else in my life. My eyes moved to my phone, sitting just inches away, and I hesitated before picking it up, because I knew that whatever I did next would be the first step in a direction I had avoided for most of my life. I started with something simple, something practical, the kind of step I would take in any other situation. I searched for records, old case files, anything connected to my father's business from that time, and it did not take long before I found references to an investigation that matched what he had described, dates that lined up with the year everything fell apart, and a name that appeared more than once. Margaret Collins. Seeing it there, in official records, in a context I had never associated with her before, made something inside me shift again, this time more sharply, because it was no longer just words on a page, it was proof that what I had read was real. I clicked through document after document, each one adding another layer to a story I had never been told, and the more I read, the clearer it became that her role had been exactly what my father described. She had stepped forward at a moment when everything could have gone in a very different direction, and she had done it without leaving anything behind that would point back to him or to me. I leaned back in my chair again, running a hand over my face as I tried to process everything at once, but it was too much, too fast, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I was not used to feeling. I did not have control over this. I could not organize it, could not reduce it to a simple explanation or a clean conclusion. It was messy and complicated and deeply personal in a way I had spent years avoiding. But one thing was clear now, in a way it had never been before. She had not disappeared without a trace. I had simply never looked. And now that I had started, I realized I could not stop. Not until I found out where she went after that day. Not until I understood what her life had been like in the years I chose not to be a part of it. And not until I faced the possibility that the person I had spent so long resenting might have been the one person who had never stopped protecting me, even when I made it clear I did not want her to. Once I started looking, it became impossible to ignore how much I had missed, not because the information was hidden, but because I had never given myself permission to search for it. And now every detail I uncovered felt like a quiet accusation against the version of myself I had been for the past 15 years. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through public records, archived reports, anything that could help me piece together what had actually happened after that day outside the courthouse, and slowly, the outline of her life began to take shape in ways I was not prepared for. There were records showing where she had been processed, dates that confirmed how long she had been gone from everything I knew, and then, After that, a gap that stretched longer than I expected, as if she had stepped out of the world entirely before finding her way back into it under circumstances I could only begin to understand. I found a reference to a rehabilitation program, then a small address listed years later in a town I had never even heard of, a place nearly 800 miles away from where I had grown up, far enough that no one who knew her before would have run into her by accident. I stared at that address for a long time, the name of the street unfamiliar, the city barely recognizable, and I tried to imagine her there, building some kind of life in a place where no one knew her past. No one knew me. No one knew the story I had believed for so long. The thought unsettled me in a way I could not fully explain, because it forced me to see her not as a memory, not as a figure from a version of my life I had closed off, but as a person who had continued living all this time without me. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly against the window as the light outside began to fade, and I realized how late it had gotten without me noticing. Hours passing in a way that felt disconnected from everything else, like I had stepped into a different timeline where the only thing that mattered was understanding what I had missed. I thought about calling someone, reaching out to the law office that had sent the letter, asking questions I did not yet know how to form, but something stopped me. The same instinct that had always pushed me to handle things on my own, to rely on information I could verify for myself rather than explanations that might come with their own version of the truth. So I kept going, following every lead I could find, cross-checking names, dates, addresses, until eventually, everything pointed back to that same small town, that same single location, as if all the scattered pieces of her life had quietly converged there over time. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly across the room, my mind racing ahead of me, already considering what it would mean to go there, to see her, to stand in front of the person I had spent half my life avoiding. And for a moment, I felt something close to hesitation, not because I did not want to know the truth anymore, but because I was not sure I was ready to face what it might do to everything I thought I understood about myself. I had built my identity on a story that now felt incomplete, and if that story changed, then so did the reasons behind so many of my choices, so many of my decisions, so many of the walls I had put up without even realizing it. I walked back to my desk and looked down at the address again, committing it to memory in a way that felt deliberate, like I was crossing a line I could not step back from. And for the first time since opening that letter, the next step felt clear, not easy, but clear. I was going to find her, not because I knew what I would say, not because I expected anything from her, but because I could no longer accept not knowing, not after everything I had just learned, not after realizing that the distance between us had never been as simple as I believed. I picked up my phone again, this time not to search, but to act, already thinking about flights, about how soon I could leave, about how long it would take to reach that town 800 miles away, and as those thoughts settled into something real, something immediate, I understood that this was no longer about the past alone. It was about what I chose to do with the truth now that I had it, and whether I was willing to face the person who had carried it all this time without ever asking me to understand. I booked the flight before I could change my mind, choosing the earliest departure the next morning, as if giving myself time would only create space for doubt to grow. And once the confirmation email appeared on my screen, everything felt more real in a way I could not undo. I packed lightly, almost mechanically, not because I had planned this kind of trip before, but because I did not know how long I would stay or what I would find when I got there, and something about that uncertainty made it difficult to prepare for anything beyond the basics. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying fragments of the letter in my mind, trying to match them with the memories I had carried for so long. But the two refused to align, and the more I tried to force them together, the more distant my past began to feel, like something I had inherited rather than experienced myself. By the time I arrived at the airport, the sky was still dark, the early morning quiet broken only by the low hum of announcements and the steady movement of travelers passing by, each one heading somewhere that made sense to them, while I stood there holding a boarding pass that represented something I had avoided for most of my life. The flight itself was uneventful, just under 2 hours in the air followed by a long drive through unfamiliar roads, the city gradually giving way to smaller towns, open fields, and stretches of highway. that seemed to go on without interruption, and with every mile that passed, the distance between my past and my present felt less abstract and more tangible, like I was physically crossing into a part of my life I had chosen not to enter until now. I rented a car at a small regional airport, the kind where everything moves slower and no one seems in a rush. And as I drove toward the address I had memorized the night before, I found myself noticing details I normally would have ignored: the quiet storefronts, the faded signs, the way people move through their day without the urgency I had grown used to, and it struck me how different this place felt from everything I had built for myself. When I finally turned onto the street, I slowed down without realizing it, my eyes scanning the row of modest houses as if one of them might stand out. But nothing about it did. It was just another quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where life continues without drawing attention to itself. I parked a short distance away and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the house that matched the address I had found. And for the first time since I started this journey, I felt something that was not just uncertainty, but hesitation rooted in something deeper, something harder to ignore. This was no longer about records or letters or pieces of a story I could analyze from a distance. This was about standing in front of the person I had spent years refusing to understand. I thought about turning around, about convincing myself that knowing the truth was enough, that I did not need to take this final step. But even as that thought formed, I knew it would not hold. Not after everything I had learned. Not after realizing how much of my life had been shaped by something I never questioned. I opened the car door and stepped out, the air cooler than I expected, carrying a stillness that felt almost deliberate. And as I walked toward the house, each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what it represented. 15 years of silence. 15 years of certainty built on something that no longer felt solid. I reached the front door and stopped, my hand hovering just inches away from the surface. And for a moment, I did nothing. I just stood there, listening to the quiet around me, feeling the weight of everything I had carried with me to this point, and realizing that whatever happened next, whatever she said or did not say, there was no going back to the version of the story I had lived with before. I raised my hand slowly and knocked, the sound sharper than I expected in the stillness, and then I waited, not sure what I was hoping for, not sure what I deserved, only knowing that the moment I had avoided for half my life had finally arrived. The seconds after I knocked felt longer than they should have, stretching out in a way that made every small sound more noticeable: the faint rustle from inside the house, the soft shift of movement behind the door, and then the quiet click of the lock turning. When the door opened, it did not happen all at once, just a few inches at first, enough for me to see a figure standing there, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked older than I remembered. Of course she did. 15 years had passed, but it was not just age. It was something quieter, something settled, like time had not hardened her, only reshaped her into someone I did not recognize but somehow still knew. Her hair had gone mostly silver, pulled back loosely, and her eyes, the same shade I had seen in the mirror my entire life, rested on me without surprise, without shock, as if she had already prepared for this moment long before I had. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first, the words I had imagined on the drive here suddenly feeling inadequate, too small for everything that stood between us. She saved me from having to try. "Daniel," she said softly, my name spoken in a way that felt both familiar and distant at the same time, and that single word carried more weight than anything else could have. I nodded, unable to trust my voice yet. And for a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other like strangers who shared a history neither of us knew how to begin explaining. She stepped back slightly and opened the door wider, a silent invitation that felt simple but carried something deeper: not expectation, not pressure, just space. I hesitated only briefly before stepping inside, the air in the house warm and still, carrying a faint scent of something familiar I could not quite place. The interior was modest, clean, filled with small details that suggested a quiet life: books neatly arranged on a shelf, a worn armchair by the window, a framed photograph on the wall that I noticed without fully focusing on, because my attention kept returning to her. She closed the door behind me and turned, her hands resting lightly in front of her, the same gesture I remembered from years ago, and for a moment, I felt that strange overlap again, past and present blending in a way that made it hard to separate one from the other. "I did not expect you to come," she said, her voice calm, not accusing, not surprised, just stating something that felt true without needing explanation. I swallowed, finally finding my voice, though it came out quieter than I intended. "I got a letter," I said, the words simple but heavy, and her expression shifted just slightly, not into shock, but into something like understanding, as if she had always known this moment might come, just not when. She nodded once, slowly, and for a second, I thought she might say more, explain something, fill the silence with answers I had spent the last day searching for, but she did not. Instead, she looked at me with a kind of patience I was not prepared for, the kind that does not demand anything, does not rush, does not try to control what comes next. And that was what unsettled me the most. I had expected anger, or distance, or even indifference, something that would justify the years I had stayed away, something that would make this easier to understand, but there was none of that. Just quiet presence. I looked around the room again, trying to steady myself, trying to find something to hold on to, but everything felt different now, not because of the place, but because of what I knew, because of what I had not known before. I took a step closer, my hands slightly unsteady at my sides, and finally said the one thing that had been building inside me since I read that first line of the letter. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice low, careful, as if saying it too loudly might break something fragile between us, what he wrote. She did not answer right away. She simply looked at me, really looked at me, as if measuring something beyond the question itself, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not dramatic, not defensive, just true. And in that moment, everything shifted again, not in the way it had when I read the letter, but in a quieter, deeper way, because this was no longer words on a page. This was her, standing in front of me, confirming a truth I had spent years refusing to imagine. I stood there for a long moment after she nodded, the weight of that simple confirmation settling into something far more complex than I had expected, because it did not come with explanation or defense. It did not try to guide me toward understanding. It simply existed, leaving me to face what it meant on my own. I took a slow breath, my eyes searching her face for something familiar, something that could connect the person I had just met with the memory I had carried for years. But what I found instead was something quieter, something steady, a kind of calm that did not demand anything from me, not even forgiveness. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked finally, the question coming out more fragile than I intended, because it was not just about the truth. It was about everything that had followed from not knowing it. She did not look away. "Because you were supposed to have a life that was not defined by it," she said, her voice even, as if she had answered this question many times in her own mind long before I ever asked it out loud. "Your father believed the same thing. We agreed on that." I shook my head slightly, the words difficult to accept even now. "I thought you left," I said, the sentence feeling smaller as soon as it left my mouth, like it belonged to someone younger, someone who had not known how to question it. "I know," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just acknowledgement, as if my misunderstanding had always been part of the cost she had already accepted. That was what made it harder. If she had been angry, if she had demanded something from me, it might have been easier to respond, easier to defend the years I had stayed away, but she did none of that. She simply stood there, present and unguarded in a way I did not know how to meet. I looked down at my hands for a moment, noticing the slight tremor I could not quite control, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something I had kept buried under certainty and distance. Regret, not sharp and immediate, but slow and heavy, building in a way that made it difficult to ignore. "I never tried to find you," I said, the words quiet, almost more to myself than to her, and she gave a small nod, as if she had always known that too. "You were not supposed to," she said gently. That was the point. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and something about that answer shifted everything again, because it removed the last piece of justification I had been holding on to, the idea that I had simply followed what I believed to be true. Instead, I had accepted a version of the story without ever questioning it, and she had allowed me to, not because she did not care, but because caring had meant letting me believe it. I looked back up at her, really seeing her now, not as the figure I had defined for so long, but as the person standing in front of me, someone who had lived an entire life beyond the version I had reduced her to. I do not know how to fix this, I admitted, the honesty of it surprising even me, because for most of my life, I had prided myself on knowing exactly what to do next, on having a plan, on staying in control, but none of that applied here. She smiled slightly, not in a way that dismissed what I was saying, but in a way that softened it. There is nothing to fix, she said. There is only what you choose to do now. I let those words settle, feeling their weight in a different way than everything else that had come before, because they did not try to rewrite the past. They did not promise that anything could be undone. They simply placed the responsibility back in front of me in a way I could not avoid. I glanced around the room again, taking in the quiet details of the life she had built here, and for a moment, I realized how much of it I had missed, how many years had passed without me even asking where she was, what she was doing, whether she was okay. That realization did not come with a solution. It did not offer a clear path forward, but it did something else, something more important. It changed how I saw her. And in doing that, it changed something in me. I took a small step forward, closing the distance between us that had existed for far longer than the space in that room. And this time, when I spoke, my voice felt steadier. I would like to stay for a while, I said, not as a demand, not as an expectation, but as a choice I was finally making for myself. She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded, the same quiet acceptance she had shown from the moment I arrived, and as simple as that gesture was, it carried something I had not expected to feel. Not resolution, not closure, but the beginning of something I had never allowed before. Understanding.